We're going to do something a little bit different this time than what we normally do. We're in Luke chapter 8, and we're going to go through the first part of it, and then we are going to read through another part of it with no commentary, and then we're going to watch something. Because as I was going through my notes and reviewing this today, I came to this part and I went, oh, where's all my notes on this part that I got from that documentary thing, that half-hour long documentary? Where's all my notes on this? And I couldn't find them, so I went and watched the documentary again, and then I went, this is just good enough that I think I just want to show the documentary thing. So it's a half-hour long thing, and we will talk about it a little bit more. It's made by a liberal scholar, which means that he is not what we would call a Christian. He does not believe that Jesus was God. He may not be Christian at all. I'm not sure if he is atheist or if he is Jewish. He is from Israel. But he made quite a name for himself making a movie about Jesus' supposed wife and children and all this other stuff. So you have to take what you see from him with a grain of salt, because he is going at it from the perspective of we can't ever trust the Bible. That's his baseline where he starts off from. But when you look at the things that he manages to discover and then compare them, if you do have a high opinion of the Bible and a high view of Scripture, and you do think that the Bible is credible and truthful, then you can look at what... She's okay with that one. You can look at what he discovers, which he's discovering it to try to disprove Christianity, but you can look at what he discovers, and sometimes he actually does discover things that are really, really interesting. That if you look at them through the lens of the Bible, rather than looking at them as something that's going to contradict the Bible, they actually can make a lot of sense. And that was this particular thing that we're going to watch today, is something that I had never heard before because nobody's ever questioned it. But in fact, it doesn't contradict the Bible at all. And it's a really interesting idea of how what this chapter is actually talking about. So we're going to look at that a little bit later, but we're going to go ahead and start at the beginning of Luke chapter 8. And this chapter, oops.
Open your book. It's God backwards.
That's actually pretty perfect.
This chapter starts off with a bit of parables, which we have lots and lots of parables in Luke, and goes on to start describing Jesus as master over different aspects. Luke knew ancient folklore, and his Gentile audience also knew ancient folklore.
I knew that.
So regardless of what Jesus was actually doing in this chapter, how he did it, where he did it, what order he did it in, Luke arranges these stories back to back to back to show us a Jesus who's ready to go to war as a deity with other gods and evil spirits, and he's going to be in control. So starting with verse 1, now it came to pass afterward that he went through every city and village, preaching and bringing the glad tidings of the kingdom of God. And the 12 were with him. And certain women who had been healed of evil spirits and infirmities, Mary called Magdalene, out of whom had come 7 demons, Joanna the wife of Chuza, Herod's steward, and Susanna, and many others who provided for him from their substance. Okay, we have a bunch of women named here. Mary called Magdalene. I think everybody's heard of Mary Magdalene, and there's all of the drama surrounding the story of Mary Magdalene. It is worth noting that neither Luke nor his source makes any kind of association between Mary Magdalene and the woman from the previous chapter. Remember the woman from the previous chapter who was washing Jesus' feet? A lot of times when you see Jesus movie depictions, that's Mary Magdalene. That association is not made in the gospel itself. They're if they were the same person, it's certainly not noted. She had 7 demons come out of her, and that's all that we know about her. We have these women being named here, and what's really interesting about Jesus' association with women is not the fact that he spoke with women and valued them, because Judaism actually valued women more than any other ancient religion and culture. The Mishnah actually indicates that the Jewish extra teachings indicate that women actually associated with the rabbis. So they could be students of rabbis. So it's not that he valued them. The really remarkable thing about them is that they traveled with him. And the reason why that is so remarkable is that that would have made them appear an awful lot like the camp followers of the Romans. When the Roman armies came and went, they took along with them a bunch of women. And they were wives, or they were women who wanted to be wives, or they were just the prostitutes. And they would follow the camps of Roman soldiers around. So the fact that Jesus has women following along with him makes him suspect and makes them suspect. He did not. It's remarkable that he did not send them away, even though they could give him a bad reputation of somebody who would keep these prostitutes, these known prostitutes a lot of times, along with him in his camp. And in fact, it did tarnish his image, as we can tell from all of the later speculation about Jesus marrying a woman at some point, usually Mary Magdalene, they say. That all came out of the fact that this woman traveled with him. And that was not normal for women to travel unless they were wives, aspiring wives, or prostitutes being used by the people who were running the camp. So Luke especially includes the mention of the women not only because of the universalism of his gospel, where his gospel particularly applies to everyone. Jew, Gentile, man, woman, old, young, doesn't matter. Jesus is interested in all of them. But also for Luke's purposes, women were among the people who most notably carried the tradition of the early church. The early church was run by a lot of women. There were men as well, but there were a lot of women doing the early church. And they carried a lot of the traditions. So Luke's point is that these women who are carrying on these traditions, they have firsthand knowledge as well. They were there. And the women who saw him resurrected, they didn't get mistaken and mixed him up with somebody else. They knew him because they had been traveling with him. They had been there with him, and they would not mistake him for somebody else. Okay, so Mary Magdalene, Joanna, the wife of Herod's steward, that could mean anything from a high-ranking servant to a Roman procurator like Pontius Pilate, governing official. Based on Luke's use of the word elsewhere, the latter is probably more likely. So this would be somebody of very high aristocracy, very wealthy. They're not mentioned again anywhere else, but they are mentioned here. And Susanna is also unknown, but she is mentioned here, even without her mention of her husband, suggesting that she had a lot of wealth of her own. And the fact that she's mentioned, everybody is just supposed to know who she is by name because she was so well known in the early church that Luke was writing to. So when a great multitude had gathered, and they had come to him from every city, he spoke by a parable. This is usually called the parable of the sower. And in more recent scholarship, we have sort of said that's a horrible thing to call it, because the parable isn't really about the sower at all. It's about the 4 kinds of soil that he sows into. So a sower went out to sow his seed, and as he sowed, some fell by the wayside, and it was trampled down, and the birds of the air devoured it. Some fell on a rock, and as soon as it sprang up, it withered away because it lacked moisture. And some fell among thorns, and the thorns sprang up with it and choked it. But others fell on good ground, sprang up, and yielded a crop 100-fold. When he had said these things, he cried, "He who has ears to hear, let him hear." Okay, so seed is scattered, broadcast style, falls wherever it may. And these are the 4 different kinds of places where it may end up. Okay, so then his disciples asked him, saying, "What does this parable mean?" And he said, "To you it has been given to know the mysteries of the kingdom of God, but to the rest it is given in parables, that seeing they may not see, and hearing they may not understand. Now the parable is this. The seed is the word of God. Those by the wayside are those who hear. Then the devil comes and takes the word out of their hearts, lest they should believe and be saved. But the ones on the rock are those who, when they hear, receive the word with joy, and these have no root, who believe for a while, and in time of temptation fall away. Now the ones that fell among the thorns are those who, when they have heard, go out and are choked with cares, riches, and pleasures of life, and bring no fruit to maturity. But the ones that fell on the good ground are those who, having heard the word, having heard the word with a noble and good heart, keep it and bear fruit with patience." Okay. This interpretation has caused a lot of controversy because there's a lot of people who don't think that Jesus would have reduced a parable to this kind of a simplicity. Parables were very well known, very well understood teaching methods in Judaism. And it came, once the early church got handed all of these parables, they went into 2 different schools of thought for how to interpret them. One looked at typology, which we're not going to talk about because I'd have to use illustrations and all kinds of other things. The other one did allegory. And it said that for every element of the parable, there has to be something it stands for. And that's how they interpreted all the parables. And sometimes they got downright ridiculous with trying to figure out what this stood for or that stood for or how this related to that other thing in trying to allegorize it. This reads like it's being allegorized. And also it changes the audience. The parable speaks to an audience, a group of people, and it tells them what does the parable itself tell people? What's the takeaway from the story in the parable? You sow it, it falls, it gets trampled, the birds devour it, or it fell on a rock and then it withered, or it fell on the thorns and the thorns choked it, or it fell on good ground and sprang up and yielded a crop 100-fold. What is it? What is the goal of telling people this? What are you trying to get them to do? Or to be?
To be the one that lost, to consider where they're at.
Yes. To be good ground. That's the goal of it. You're teaching people you should be good ground. Because if you're not good ground, you're one of these other kinds of ground and you're going to die. You're not going to produce anything. But if you look at the interpretation is speaking to the disciples and instructing them as the sowers and explaining to them why preaching doesn't always work. So you go out and you preach to the ones at the wayside, and the devil comes and takes the word out of their hearts, lest they should believe and be saved. And then you go and preach to the rocks, and they receive with joy but have no root, and then they fall into temptation and fall away. And then you preach to the thorns, and they get choked up. And then you preach to the good ground, and that's all good. So it changes. So the interpretation also blurs a little bit whether the seed is the word or whether the seed is the person. It's one of those things that it's there in the Bible. It's there. And for many people, myself included, that is enough for me to say it is truth. Because it is there. And it is there very explicitly. That doesn't mean that it is the only thing that you can gather from the parable of the 4 soils. If you ever are looking at that parable and seeing something that is not the simple interpretation, this goes for all of the parables that we're going to look at. If you ever look at a parable and see something in there that does not conform with what the explanation that follows tells you exactly what it is, there is more to a parable than one explanation. There always is. Because that's how parables were designed. Parables were designed to make you think and make you relate and make you incorporate these ideas and work through it. It's designed to be subjective. The parables were just designed that way. So it's when you're reading parables, and I love teaching on parables. When you're reading parables, look at different options when you're reading them, and you don't have to be limited by what the interpretation that follows says, even if the interpretation is absolutely correct. Definitely correct. There may still be more in there. Okay, no one when he has lit a lamp covers it with a vessel or puts it under a bed, but sets it on a lampstand, that those who enter may see the light. For nothing is secret that will not be revealed, nor anything hidden that will not be known and come to light. Okay. Verse 16. What happens if you cover an oil lamp?
Goes out.
Yes, goes out. Probably the normal way of extinguishing it. You said something over it. What happens if you put it under a bed?
It sets your bed on fire.
Yes! So what's the takeaway from this?
Don't do that because that's stupid. Just don't.
Use the candle properly. Don't be stupid.
Yeah.
Or it's not only useless, it can actually be harmful. So you have a useless candle if you light it and then extinguish it, and you have a harmful candle if you decide to set your bed on fire with it. So it's pretty straightforward.
Nice.
And then we have the next verse. Nothing is secret that will not be revealed, nor anything hidden that will not be known and come to light. And the question is this supposed to be the interpretation of the one before it? Because a lot of times people will assume that this is the interpretation of the lamp. But the interpretation doesn't at all fit the parable. The interpretation is about hidden things becoming known. So probably this is another saying that was collected and put into this section that actually doesn't even relate to the one right before it. Which can make a difference when you're looking at the interpretations of it. Because I'd never actually heard anybody give the interpretation of just verse 16 on its own. But it is pretty straightforward. Use a candle properly. Don't be stupid with it. And then your next statement in verse 17 is talking about something completely different. And then in the next statement, it's again talking about something completely different. It's like you have different sayings of Jesus, different snippets of things that he said that Luke is just listing here. Key points that people would have remembered and memorized in their oral traditions, and ends up getting passed down to Luke. Therefore take heed how you hear, for whoever has to him more will be given, and whoever does not have even what he seems to have will be taken away from him. So another saying that doesn't seem to connect to the parable at all, although it might be a warning to simply listen to the parable. Okay, verse 19. Then his mother and brothers came to him and could not approach him because of the crowd. And it was told to him by some who said, "Your mother and your brothers are standing outside, desiring to see you." But he answered and said to them, "My mother and my brothers are these who hear the word of God and do it." Okay.
Oh, snap. I wouldn't be pleased if my son said that to me.
Yeah.
Anyone's my mother if they hear.
And this is actually toned down a bit from the way that it was in Mark. Because in Mark, he actually goes, who is my mother and my brother? Here's everybody who's my mother and brothers. You know, really just kind of, yeah.
I've got a question.
Yep.
So all these, so Matthew, Mark, Luke, do they all talk about Jesus the same things? That they're all talking about the same things? Because I see here it says in Matthew, Jesus' mother and brothers, and it says here in Luke, Jesus' mother and brothers. So they're all talking about the same things, pretty much, of what they seen Jesus, or what they heard about Jesus.
Yes, they have. There were several different sources that were used to write the first three Gospels. The fourth Gospel is a whole different ball of wax. But the first three Gospels had certain sources that were used. Mark is generally accepted to have been written first. Then Matthew and Luke both had Mark to look at as a source. And they also had another source that we call Q. And we call it Q because that's the beginning of the German word Quell, which is the German word for source. So it's called Q. And it'll make you sound really smart if you say, yes, Q, the source behind the Gospels. But it is. Luke had in front of him, when he wrote, he had probably the Gospel of Mark. He had his own source material that we usually will call L, just because it's Luke's source material. Mm-hmm. And then he had Q.
Okay.
And
Q
so,
and L,
yes. And then Matthew, when he wrote, he would have had Mark and M and Q. And so they all say it a little bit different because, like, Matthew, the story that Matthew got, it was the same story, it was the same event, it was the same people who were there, but they told it to him a little bit different. So in his M material, it's different than the L material, or it's recording something that Luke didn't get the tradition, but Matthew did. So it's
Different people see it from different
it's like
perspectives.
it's like three people in here writing the same information, but with our own little bit of.
Yeah. Alright. Yeah.
Insights.
You can look at the Gospels side by side to see the same story written from each one, like in a parallel thing. There's a book called the Synopsis of the four Gospels. Not sure, but it has all of them side by side to show how they're similar and how they're different.
That's interesting.
It is a really neat book.
I just assumed that they would all just say the same information, but I never really thought too much about how it would differ.
Yeah.
I looked at the Bible like intently going,
Mm.
what's that word mean and why does it look like this is helping with that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of a learned thing that you have to learn and practice with doing. So yes, this section, Mark was a bit more forthright, and Luke actually tones that down. Possibly didn't want to be insulting as much to Mary, saying as, his source may have been Mary. It's entirely possible that Mary could have been his source for a lot of his material. So, he left that out.
Well, there's no everything.
Why is he so?
I don't want to see my family
Yeah,
because he's doing a job.
he's doing a job. Okay.
He's at work.
He's
It's
at
not
work.
so bad. You can't visit.
Okay.
I guess family, people who don't know you seem to take heed more than family kind of blow you off, kind of.
Mm.
Not take you as serious, maybe.
Or they think they have special privileges. They might have thought that, hey, we've rocked up, you need to just drop everything and come for dinner.
Yeah.
Expectation.
Yeah.
If that were me, I'd be like, come on.
Yeah.
He's at work, he's doing a job. He knew his time doing that job were numbered.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
it wasn't going to stop until it was convenient for him.
Yeah. Their reason for visiting isn't stated, but based on Jesus's response, pretty much disowning them, you can assume that he actually expected them to be somewhat antagonistic. At least he is antagonizing them. But remember, they're coming from the same town that tried to stone him at the beginning. When he went back to his town, and he had that wonderfully successful sermon, and everybody went, yay, what a wonderful sermon. And then he started antagonizing them. And they all decided to throw him off a cliff. That was his hometown. Where were his brothers?
Hiding.
They could have been part of the crowd.
Yeah, they very well could have been.
So, just a couple chapters ago, they wanted to throw him off a cliff.
Maybe they
Mother
still
would have died.
No, I don't think his mother would have wanted to. But
But
certainly...
if Jesus was your sibling, I mean, Joseph's siblings didn't like him. He was just Joseph.
Yeah.
He's the oldest, He's got the oldest the responsibility of, I'm right, he'll listen to me. Yeah, the extra Holy Spirit function.
Yeah. Okay. So my mother and my brothers are those who hear the word of God and do it. Okay, now we get verse 22 into the weird story. And we're just going to read this through, and you're going to go, how is that weird? That's not weird at all. I've heard this story 100,000 times, and it makes perfect sense to me. I know this story. And then we're going to watch this documentary, and it's going to make you go, hang on a minute. This is a weird story. All right, we're just going to read it. Just going to read it through.
That salsa is open.
Starting at verse 22. Now it happened on a certain day that he got into a boat with his disciples. And he said to them, "Let us cross over to the other side of the lake." And they launched out. But as they sailed, he fell asleep. And a windstorm came down on the lake, and they were filling with water and were in jeopardy. And they came to him and awoke him, saying, "Master, Master, we are perishing." Then he arose and rebuked the wind and the raging of the water, and they ceased, and there was calm. But he said to them, "Where is your faith?" And they were afraid and marveled, saying to one another, "Who can this be? For he commands even the winds and water, and they obey him." Then they sailed into the country of the Gadarenes, which is opposite Galilee. And when he stepped out onto the land, there met him a certain man from the city who had demons for a long time. And he wore no clothes, nor did he live in a house, but in the tombs. And when he saw Jesus, he cried out, fell down before him, and with a loud voice said, "What have I to do with you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, do not torment me." For he had commanded the unclean spirits to come out of the man. For it often seized him, and he was kept under guard, bound with chains and shackles, and he broke the bonds and was driven by the demon into the wilderness. Jesus asked him, saying, "What is your name?" And he said, "Legion," because many demons had entered him. And they begged him that he would not command them to go out into the abyss. Now a herd of many swine was feeding there on the mountain. So they begged him that he would permit them to enter them. And he permitted them. Then the demons went out of the man and entered the swine, and the herd ran violently down the steep place into the lake and drowned. When those who fed them saw what had happened, they fled and told it in the city and in the country. Okay, and we're going to go ahead and stop there. Is there anything about this story that strikes anybody as odd?
Yeah.
Nope.
I was gonna say, why would Jesus bother asking who the demon was? Like, it doesn't matter. And then I thought it was weird that he lets them choose
Yeah.
where he's going to send them. And then send them into these poor innocent pigs who went and drowned, and so now their owners have lost their income, so to speak. So they've been affected. And then what did they go to tell the people? Good things or bad things about Jesus, what he did to them?
Okay. You mentioned the pigs and the pigs' owners. What did the Jews think of pigs?
They're unclean.
Yeah, they're unclean.
So why
So-
did they have them?
Exactly. Why did they have them?
Ooh.
Where is this?
Ooh.
Because
Mine says Gerasenes.
Gerasenes, yeah, Gerasenes, Gadarenes, they would be the same.
Yeah, why do they have pigs?
Why do they have a huge huge herd of swine chilling?
Maybe for that exact reason.
Maybe
Because that's
Yeah.
what they thought to cast demons into.
Maybe.
Something they're good for.
Okay.
or maybe
Yeah.
they just like sold the pigs to like foreign lands or something like that. Like other
The existence of the pigs is kind of unusual. The other thing is, anybody ever seen a Jesus movie and the boats that are on the Sea of Galilee? You see those boats that are on the Sea of Galilee? Not very big. So how did Jesus manage to sleep through a hurricane, cyclone?
He's really, really tired.
Really, really tired. Yeah.
It was a God-induced coma.
Got in his coma. Oh. He's here.
Well, Lazarus was sleeping, wasn't he? Lazarus slept.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So that's another thing about this that's a little bit unusual.
Do you have answers?
I do have answers. I have a whole documentary with
Well, hang on.
answers. Okay. Now we're going to watch the first 30 minutes of this episode. This episode is actually 45 minutes long. However,
It's alright.
the Last 15 minutes gets very liberal. And not something that I think really has much to contribute. Like I said, this guy, you do have to watch him with a grain of salt. But he actually is, if you can filter through, if you already know that you believe the Bible, you can watch his stuff and actually learn a lot from him. You just have to, when he starts going on about how Jesus' wife and children and so on and so forth, you just kind of have to go and ignore him. But the actual stuff that he learned, that he discovers from archaeology, he actually does make some really good episodes. This series was called Secrets of Christianity. So, thoughts?
Interesting.
It's not provable. And he, of course, has a very different reason for exploring it than we do as Christians. But it is an interesting possibility that I had never considered before. That
Because we don't know what the Sea of Galilee looks like. We don't know, like, so...
I
we've
had
been
not-
there.
Yeah, I had not
We wouldn't have the
realized just
means
how
to do
strange. I knew it was strange. I knew the pigs were strange. I remember thinking, why are there a bunch of pigs in a Jewish place? And then, they said, well, it was a Gentile territory. But even if it's a Gentile, where's this Gentile territory that's right next to where, because it's not Samaria, because even they don't do pigs. They're not Gentiles either. They're Samaritans. So, like, where is this big city with these cliffs where all these pigs were at? It was always a question of mine. And I think it's an interesting possibility. Does it change anything? No, it really doesn't.
I had a question.
Yeah.
I got lost with reference. How did they exactly go from Jesus to Jonah? What was it? What was the word? Whereabouts is that?
It's actually in the next chapter.
Okay.
In the next chapter, they ask Jesus for a sign, and Jesus says, the only sign you're going to get is the sign of Jonah.
Okay.
Because the
He's still there.
guy who was trying to make that connection said that it's Jesus's way of referring to what had happened in the previous chapter. He was saying that it was Jesus referring back and explaining, giving us the clue for what he had
On there,
what he
you
had
mean.
done.
Right.
Yes. So he was basically saying, if that interpretation is correct, then Jesus was basically saying, you all want a sign. Look at me, I'm the new Jonah. I did what Jonah did and went and preached to the Gentiles and the equivalent of Nineveh. I went and did that, and then I came back here. I survived all of that, and now I'm back here. And that's not a big enough sign for you. So he's saying it that way. Puts a different context to it than the way that we usually think of it. We usually think of it, Jonah dead for 3 days and then rise again. But, yeah. So, it's a different interpretation.
Why, and this has probably no relevance to it, but it does when it comes to fishing, is I thought the Sea of Galilee, as they call it the Sea of Galilee, was a salt water entrapped sea.
Yeah, no.
And when he said it's fresh water, I went, oh. Because you can catch fish in fresh water, but you always catch more, and a town can survive more with salt water.
Oh, unless your salt water is the Dead Sea, in which case you catch nothing. That's their saltwater lake.
Actually, there is a bit in there, but yeah.
So,
But for some reason, I always thought the Sea of Galilee was a saltwater sea.
Yeah, because you think sea, you
Yeah.
think salt, but it's just it's a lake, but it's called the Sea of Galilee. It's not Sea Galilee.
And
Lake
this,
called the Sea of Galilee.
yeah.
and this
That's
is
where we
the
get stuck. And because we don't, unless you've been there, you just
Tasted
automatically have this sea. Oh, it's a sea. It's a sea
Yeah.
that's called Galilee. But
Yeah.
as well as the interpretation. Just like he pointed out, when you read the original Hebrew text, the way they interpret it to the books that we have here is not exactly always the same way what it's originally written. And if you take it the actual word and say, well, it could mean this or it could mean that, but they just generalized and went, okay, it's a sea.
And
a
of
big
course,
lake.
it must be the Sea of Galilee because so many other things happen at the Sea of Galilee that this clearly must be what they're talking about.
It'll be interesting to look at what he says there and then backtrack the route where Jesus said he went. Say, did he actually leave from this shore here or did he leave from this shore over here?
I don't think we
From
have
his
enough
location.
information. We don't
May
really
not
have
be.
enough information.
No.
to
But
know.
even on his
But
return
that's
trip,
what's yeah.
you know, you look at both sides of the story.
That's what's kind of cool about it, though, because I mean, obviously, you can't prove it. He came as close to proving it as what you can prove. That's as close as you'll ever come to proving it.
So he's not really against Jesus.
No, and that's why I look at it and I'm like, you know, there's
He
nothing.
just wants the truth.
Yes,
Where he was, what he did, like,
exactly.
might not think he's the son of God, but he was a real man. Like,
And that's why I do like listening to this guy and looking up his stuff, because even though he is definitely a liberal scholar, and you do have to keep in mind when you watch him that he does not believe that Jesus was God. So that's the point of difference.
But even
But
still, like, none of
He's
that came into it. He's talking about Jesus as a man and where he went and where he didn't go.
right,
And none of the other stuff come into it.
right,
He's just saying, geologically speaking, where was he?
yes. And that is what I like. Now, if we had gone the extra 15 minutes, he would have talked about all of the descendants of Jesus and the house that they live in and all of the people that, you know, yeah, he would have gotten into all of that. But, which when he starts getting into that, you just kind of have to tune him out because, you know, that just doesn't.
Yeah.
But, the archaeology stuff that he does is very, very good. And he is very good about being non-partial in the way that he looks at the evidence, the archaeological evidence.
It's not like they didn't study this brutally and didn't see those tiny scratches.
Well, you know, they have so many artifacts over there. It's not like here, you know, or even in America where, you know, we find an ancient thing and we go, oh, it's an ancient thing, put it in a museum. They have so many ancient things everywhere. I mean, couple of the episodes of this, or maybe it's in the other series that he does, the Naked Archaeologist series, you know, you go to, he takes you to some of these places that are run by these curators, and they're all of the stuff, the archaeologists, all of the stuff that they have taken out of the ground, and they still have to translate or categorize. And they basically just take a house, and they put all of the stuff in the house, and they put it everywhere in the house. So, like, they go and he's looking for one particular type of inscription or something, and so they're going and they're pulling everything out of the cupboards, and is it this? Is it this? Is it this? And then they're going and they're lifting up the bed, and they're pulling all the stuff out from underneath the bed. And there's so much of it. There's so many thousands upon thousands upon thousands of bits and pieces that have been dug out of the ground that they can't.
We think
Doing
it's
fast
so
enough.
rare. Now, obviously, we haven't been over there, but I've heard this from people who have been over there. Even Shannon has said this before, and I find this quite remarkable. That you can go over to a marketplace in the Middle East and find 2,000, 3,000-year-old artifacts just sitting on the bench there that someone's picked up off the ground somewhere with inscriptions on it that we can't read.
Yep.
You know,
And if they can get $20 for it, man, that makes their day.
yeah.
You know, it's just.
They're not supposed to be sold. It's actually illegal for them to do it and remove it from the country because it's an artifact of that country. A lot of the countries have that kind of rule, but it doesn't stop them from doing it. It's everywhere. Yeah,
People get
really.
caught with them.
Oh, I can do if they really want to search you for it, but most of
Sure,
the
it's
time.
pretty heavy though.
Yeah, it's just a rock in your suitcase type thing, and most of those places don't care or whatever anyway.
Yeah.
But it's a rule of thumb type law. But it really is. When you come to a place like in Australia, and an artifact that you find here is extremely rare.
They're not even old, like.
Yeah.
Yeah. They still have so many scrolls and so many things that haven't been translated. When I was in seminary, we were actually trying to develop a partnership with a seminary in Dallas. I think it may have actually even been Dallas Theological Seminary. Possibly. Oral Roberts University was trying to develop a partnership with them because they had just gotten access to a large number of untranslated scrolls that they were inheriting. They had purchased a bunch of scrolls that hadn't been translated yet, and they were bringing them over, and they were all original, and they were bringing them there for the scholars in the area to come together and start translating some of these Greek and Hebrew and Syriac and Aramaic scrolls so that they could be published, because there's still so much writing over there that's just not been translated and it's not been published. It's a very slow and tedious process to translate this stuff, and so there's thousands upon thousands upon thousands of scrolls that have not been translated. We talked about at the beginning of the class about how Luke may have written a 3-part thing. It's entirely possible that Luke intended to write a trilogy, but we don't have the 3rd part. Well, we don't have the 3rd part translated. We could very well have found the 3rd part already, and it's just sitting under somebody's bed over in Jerusalem. It's one of those things that, if ever it is going to come to light, it'll come to light whenever God brings it to light. But not until, because there's so much to sort through. So, yeah.
Artifacts and archaeological things move around quite surprisingly. I don't know if any of you guys realise this, but I've been up there once. Just up on the hill over here at the top of Botanical Gardens, on this side of Botanical Gardens, and you can, the roundabout, not this big roundabout, but the next one, there was an old four-wheel drive or a car for sale there, but there's a little gate and a walkway. You follow that walkway up to the top of the hill, that's the site of a meteorite finding, and there's a plaque up there. That meteorite is in a museum in America. It's written on there, and it actually tells you which museum it's in. It's one of the things that we're going to go to. We haven't walked up there yet, but I've seen that 10 plus years ago.
Why did you go to America?
No idea.
They wanted it.
They
They wanted to
would've
study
bought
it, put it in a museum.
Yeah, they would have bought it. I don't know the reason why, but it just goes to show that how things can move around. Many, many, many years ago. This is in the 60s or 70s when it was discovered. But yeah, there's a plaque up the top there telling you all about it.
Plaque with no meteorite.
No. I don't think it was big. I think it was probably... Hey?
Is the hole there? Oh, no.
No, I think it was probably only about the size of a tennis ball.
I
Oh,
thought it was like,
come on. That's nothing. No wonder we got rid of it.
But somebody found it up there. A rock out of many others. And recognised
Maybe
it.
$6.
Yeah. Who knows?
Alright, so next time we will go back over this story a little bit and just chat a little bit more about it. And sort of bridge from that onward. But yeah, if you're looking for something interesting on YouTube, check this guy out. He is pretty good.